Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Just let me know in the chat if you can, or unmute yourself and say, we can hear you, Professor, or one or the other. I'm letting
We can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, good.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good.
You're good.
Thank you. Thank you. If you notice, I'm in a different space. I think I mentioned to you all that I would be moving out of one apartment to another. So there's a lot of things in flux. So just getting used to being in this other space. And so the internet was a little choppy this morning, but I think it's found its groove. So I'm going to keep going. So thanks for being here. Thanks for doing the assignment. I think almost everyone did it, which was great, reading the responses. For those of you who were not here on Monday, we have begun also thank you for getting your essays in. I will be looking at those over the next couple of days, and the plan is to have everything graded by Monday so that we could have a discussion about the essays. So I'm going to say something about that in a moment. So today we're going to continue. We've begun our fiction section, and last class we quickly went through the handout on fiction. And I'm just doing a little bit of this. The handout of the fiction, so to kind of give us a little bit of an orientation on it. So today we're going to continue, but first I'm going to just open it up for everybody who got their essays done and in. Like, how was it? How was the experience? Did you feel, do you have any questions from it or any reactions to getting your first formal essay done? You can chat it out, you can shout it out. Let me check the chat 1 second. I see I have 2 responses, just to hearing me. Okay. Okay, good. You survived, you did it. Okay. All right, but yeah, if anybody has any questions or any reactions, let me know. I'm always curious to hear your experience of getting the work done. So we continue on our path, right? So this class, what you're doing is you're learning to look at literary texts, right? Being able to read them, understand them, comment on them, see what the craft elements that writers are using to create them. In poetry, we spent lots of time looking at themes, looking at poetic elements like symbols and metaphors, and talking about sound and different things that are used, that poets use to construct a poem. And in fiction, we're translating some of those skills into a different genre, into prose writing, into fiction writing. And so we talked a lot about some of the elements of fiction. Some of them translate, like we said, and some of them are different. And the 3 main different ones that we said from the last class were that in fiction, there's characters, there's plot, and there's settings. In class, we read a very tiny story, a story that would be considered flash fiction, right? That's called Styx. And so we're going to continue talking about that. And I asked you to do an assignment. One was to both on Styx and both on another short story called AMP by John Updike. And so that one we will also examine today as well. And then we'll talk about the story for next week. And we will continue in this path, like opening up stories, talking about them, looking at them from that lens, also talking about themes, all kinds of stuff now, except we'll be doing this with short stories. The group of short story writers that we are encountering are, I believe, mostly American or are very popular or included in the American kind of, I want to use a word that is academic, but I don't normally subscribe to, and the word is a part of a canon of American works. And so there may be people who are not American that are part of that canon. And I say that because there are also people who are not in the canon that are American and are writers that we will be reading. The other thing is that my new apartment now faces the street. So if you're hearing a siren that I'm hearing, before my other apartment faced the back and the courtyard. So it was much more quieter. So, and if the sound gets too much, I can also put my headphones in to try to focus more my voice and not all the ambient sound. And teaching during the pandemic age, that siren's gonna make me crazy. All right, hopefully they resolved the issue, probably the car blocked. But back to fiction, that's another story, right? So back to fiction. So let's look at Styx. So I'm gonna share my screen and I'm gonna go to the story. The story is included in Elements of Fiction, the handout. The handout is inside of the course content folder, the course content tab under the handout folder, which is the first one. And then there's another folder in there that's about fiction, and those are where the stories are. So I'm going to share my screen and let's take a look at we'll go back to Styx, and then we'll talk about your climax. And I'll share with you what that is here. So before I go to climax, since we're in Elements of Fiction, I'll stop here for a minute. And so your assignment was to identify the climax in the story for Styx, or for you to read it and for you to make your interpretation of what that climax could be. So when I'm referring to climax, and this is just a refresher for those of you who are here and for those of you who are not here, definitely read this handout, because the climax is a point in the story that is where the action changes that's related to the main plot elements, right? And climax is one of the 5 parts of Freytag's triangle, right, of dramatic structure. So exposition is the beginning, kind of like the setting up of the story. Then we've got rising action, which is the how something happens and the story continues to escalate or the plot develops. And then there's a moment where something happens, or maybe a series of things happen, but there's something that changes the plot of the story, and usually the plot is related to the main character. And then there's some kind of falling action that, you know, and it could be toward a resolution, but toward at least an ending of the story, right? And so that's what we're talking about with the dramatic arc. So then I asked you all to take another look and read through the story that's at the end of this, of all of this, called Sticks by George Saunders. And I am just adjusting the size so that you can take a peek at it together. And it's a tiny story. So I'm just going to read it one more time just to bring it back into the room. And then I'm going to unmute it. And unmute it. I am unmuted. You can unmute yourselves, or you can put in the chat. And I'm going to ask you, you know, what do you think the climax was based on the dramatic arc? And then we can look at this story a little more too. So Sticks by George Saunders. Every year, Thanksgiving night, we flocked out behind Dad as he dragged the Santa suit to the road and draped it over a kind of crucifix he'd built out of a metal pole in the yard. Super Bowl week, the pole was dressed in a jersey and Rod's helmet, and Rod had to clear it with Dad if he wanted to take the helmet off. On the 4th of July, the pole was Uncle Sam. On Veterans Day, a soldier, and on Halloween, a ghost. The pole was Dad's only concession to glee. We were allowed a single crayon from the box at a time. One Christmas Eve, he shrieked at Kimmy for wasting an apple. He hovered over us as we poured ketchup, saying, "Good enough, good enough, good enough." Birthday parties consisted of cupcakes, no ice cream. The first time I brought a date over and she said, "What's with your dad and that pole?" And I sat there blinking. We left home, married, had children of our own, found the seeds of meanness blooming also within us. Dad began dressing the pole with more complexity and less discernible logic. He draped some kind of fur over it on Groundhog Day and lugged out a floodlight to ensure a shadow. When an earthquake struck Chile, he laid the pole on its side and spray painted a rift in the earth. Mom died, and he dressed the pole as death and hung from the crossbars photos of Mom as a baby. We'd stop by and find odd talismans from his youth arranged around the base: army medals, theater tickets, old sweatshirts, tubes of Mom's makeup. One autumn, he painted the pole bright yellow. He covered it with cotton swabs that winter for warmth and provided offspring by hammering in 6 cross sticks around the yard. He ran the lengths of string between the pole and the sticks and taped to the string letters of apology, admissions of error, and pleas for understanding, all written in a frantic hand on index card. He painted a sign saying "love" and hung it from the pole, and another that said "forgive." Then he died in the hall with the radio on, and we sold the house to a couple who yanked the pole and sticks and left them by the road on Garbage Day. Okay, so that is the story. So we began last class talking about characters, right? The characters in the story. So we talked about the dad, right? And some of you wrote that, you know, the dad, wrote characteristics about the dad. And I said, where did you get them? And you said, from the story, right? So that was good. So we do learn things about the dad, right? Sometimes a lot of it is indirect representation and some of it is direct, right? So the dad's activities, first of all, there's something unusual that he has a relationship with this pole, like creates like almost like a crucifix. So it's like a stick like this with a stick across here. And then he drapes things on this stick, right? He dresses it up for the holidays, like for Halloween, it's a ghost. For the Super Bowl, it's dressed with a jersey, and jerseys people know is a sports, you know, this kind of shirt for sports. He also, and the helmet is Rod's helmet, and Rod can't take the helmet off unless he gets Dad's permission. And anyway, so he dresses as soldiers. So there's something unusual, peculiar about the way the father is dealing with this pole, right? It also says that that pole, right, is dad's only concession to glee, right? So that is the only thing concession. Glee's happiness, right? Yes, this yes, weird Christian, and the stick is almost like family to him. Yeah, it's a manifestation of that, or it seems to be like a character, like he feels some connection to this pole. And if you look at um the line, it said that it was glad dad's only concession to glee. Glee is happiness, right here, right toward the top. Here's the line, right? The pole was dad's only concession to glee. So he's, that's where he finds his joy, right? Doesn't he have a wife, right? Doesn't he have a family? But the way he treats his wife and family is a little different, right? We see that he shrieks at Kimmy for wasting an apple slice one Christmas. He only lets them use one crayon at a time out of the box. Um, and um, and yes, Elizabeth, I know it's hilarious. I'm looking at your comments, right? So Kristen's saying it's hilarious. Elizabeth is saying the sticks bring him joy. And Adrian is saying, I think he likes the pole more than his family. Well, he certainly tends to the pole and take care of the pole more than his family, right? So we learned that, right? Too much ketchup. He's telling the kids, watch it, don't use too much ketchup. So he's always on them, right? Birthday parties, cupcakes, no ice cream, right? So there's something about like the limitations of pleasure and joy that he gets with his family, but he does it instead through these sticks, right? And then we get the sense when the narrator brings someone over a date, she says, "What's with your?" Well, the first time I brought a date over, she said, "What's with your dad in the pole?" People also, not only the family or the narrator, see that as unusual. It's interesting if we look at this. So let me just pause for a second. So we get a pretty good manifestation or a characterization of the father. There are other characters, right? We know there's a narrator, and the narrator is speaking. And he mentioned somebody named Rod and somebody named Kimmy, right? So we assume that Rod and Kimmy are siblings, right? So he has brothers and sisters, and we know that because he talks about, he says he uses them as a we. We left home, married, and had children of our own. He doesn't tell us how many children, but how many siblings do you think he might have?
Two.
I think he has 6.
All right, Viviano put 6, and Elizabeth, that was you that said 6?
Yeah, I said 6.
Why? Since you're speaking, why do you say 6?
It's because in in the second paragraph it shows when the father he puts 6 sticks like circling around. So I'm guessing like those 6 kids are like his kids.
Right. Yeah, so we don't know how many. We know there's at least 3, right? Because the narrator is speaking and he mentions Kimmy and Rod, right? But then it's interesting when he does create um, the other sticks, he puts 6 of them, right? And he literally calls them offspring, right? He gives them offspring. Um, so yeah, so you can make that inference, right? Or inference. So that's what I want you to look at that in terms of stories, because sometimes they don't tell you all the information like right up front, but they kind of infer it, right? That's what inference means, like if somebody's inferring something, right? Does it matter to know how many kids? Not, maybe not, right? But we know that there was a group of them. And in the second paragraph, look how the action moves really quickly. We left home, married, one word, had children, right, of our own. Then he says the next thing that is more direct representation of the dad, found the seeds of meanness blooming also within us, right? So he's just implying that there was some meanness to the way he was seeing his father and the way the father treated the family. Okay, so let me look at the chat a little bit because you're saying some really great things inside the chat. The sticks bring him joy, right? Elizabeth says, Adrian is saying, I think he likes the pole more than his family. And the story kind of made me sad, Lindsay. It'd be interesting to hear more about that. There is I'll talk about that in a second. I want to talk more about it. And maybe if you feel okay unmuting and saying more too, fine, or put it in the chat. But I'm going to move to Viviano. The pole is his coping mechanism after his wife's death, maladaptive coping mechanism. It says that the stick is his way of expressing his emotion. Yeah, Stacy. So It is that. It's the way the father seems to express himself. And then when he loses, right, his family, because they all moved, right, and they say the seeds of meanness blooming within them, they start seeing themselves repeating the activity that their father did with them, probably with their families, at least from the point of view of the narrator. He goes on to say the father continues, like bringing the floodlight and doing, the father continues that when Chile, there's an earthquake in Chile, and then he reflects that. And then a transformation starts to happen when the mom died, right? Kind of the way the father, but the father still continues to dress the pole up, like he doesn't stop, right? So the mom died, and then he hangs the crossbar, and then they say we stop by and find talismans, right? Um, from his youth, ranged around like army medals, theater tickets, sweatshirts, tube of mom's lipstick, and then he continues, right? Paints the pole yellow, covers it with cotton swabs. So the father's activity continues to be the same, right? And then it starts changing, right? Because then he realizes when he creates the little sticks in the yard, right? The other six offspring. And then he says he ran string around the lengths of string between the poles, right? So string kind of like connects things, and taped to the string letters of apology, right? Admissions of error, pleas for understanding, all in frantic hand, right? So scribbling frantically on index cards. Then he painted a sign that said love and hung it from the pole. Another said forgive with a question mark. Then he died, right? In the hall with the radio. And we sold the house and to a young couple who yanked out the poles and the sticks and left them by the side of the road. Right. So then the father, in the midst of all this activity, and even in the midst of all this acting, asks for forgiveness, he dies. And then what happens is he dies alone, right? Because he's in the hall with the radio. They said he writes, so there's this implication that they found him that way. And then they sell the house. And then what happens to the poles? The next people take the weird poles out and leave them on the side of the road, and they become trash. Okay. So Lindsay, you were talking about that you felt it was a sad story. Do you want to share more, or it by voice or in the chat?
Yeah, it kind of made me sad reading it. When we did the assignment, I wrote that I noticed that the theme kind of changed from the beginning to the end, because he was very festive, dressing up the pole for 4th of July, Veterans Day, and then after his wife died, the theme changed, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah, things definitely changed after the wife died, right? They actually became strange, right? He started doing the cotton swabs, and it's keen to make that observation that beforehand, that even though there seemed to be something celebratory, even though it may seem strange, there was something like it was like, what do we do for holidays? People for Christmas to put their lights in their house. Halloween, some people decorate their homes for Halloween. There's an idea of decoration, celebration that people do with holidays. But after the mother dies, the way in which his relationship to the poles changed, right? And then even evolved to asking for forgiveness, because if you imagine, he's alone now. Not only all his kids gone and they stop by, but the mother's gone, his wife's gone. We know nothing about his wife, right, in this story. So there's sometimes in looking at these stories, there is something. I was curious with Lindsay when you put that and reading your comment as well, because there is almost an unemotional way the way this narrator is telling the story, right? Like almost like listing facts, right? The action moves really fast, and there's all this emotional stuff happening in the story, but the narrator doesn't tell the story that way. It just gives you the bare facts. Like even when the father died, like mom died, like mom suddenly like the mother's dead, mom died, and he dressed the pole. Like you don't even pause, right? He doesn't even say mom died, period. Like to give them an IRS, he goes right into the next line and continues, right? Yes, there is an indifference that the narrator has, right? And he talks about that sense of meanness blooming in him, right? Blooming in him as well as his siblings. And then when the father dies, right, at the end, he's like, and then he died in the hall with the radio on. And so we sold the house. There's no emotional, but it's like the father died, in the hall with the radio on, and we sold the house to a young couple who yanked out the poles and the sticks and left them by the road. Right? So looking at how, in this case, the author, the writer, is also crafting the story. This is when we talk about poems, right? The words they use, the action, and here the tone of the story is very matter of fact about stuff that's very emotional, and and um, yeah, and so much happens in this tiny little space. So so going to your assignments, what did folks feel? Because there was consensus around two particular events in the story, but there were different kinds of responses to what folks felt was the climax in this story. Anybody want to give us a moment that they wrote in their response, or put it in the chat, or unmute and speak it?
I feel like pretty much when the wife died and he was left all alone, like when he was like left all alone is when he started like doing different activities to cope with what he had done throughout his life with his family, like the way he treated his family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the death of, and some okay, some there's so those were the two that are coming through, and this is what was happening in your they seem to be, on the one hand, when the wife died, right, and the why of that, and other one says that when the father died, that's the climax of the story. So a death of a living can really change the one's view of the world. Yes. So it's interesting because with this story, I love starting with the story because it raises that conflict for us almost right away, right? Because as many of you made the case in your response, and as I can't see who was it was a Christian that was just speaking.
Well, I think, Professor, I think that the climax start when the children left the house, like when he's left alone with his wife, but like also the death of his wife, like has a little to do with the change, but like I think it starts when he's left alone with his wife, only him and his wife.
So say that again. So you think, Adrian, that when so are you saying that it was his wife's death that was the climax, or you're saying?
No, I'm saying like when the kids, like the children that he has
Mm-hmm.
left the house, like they got married and they got their own kids and everything. I think that's the climax.
Right. Well, what's interesting with this, more wife's deaths, father's deaths. Okay, that seems to be the two, except Adrian's bringing a third possibility into the conversation. So some of the ways to look at like what is a climax, right? Is that the story usually is interesting because this story is very short, but there's two things happening, right? One is we've got this character that clearly is the main character, which is the father, right? And so usually the climax is something that happens to the father that creates a change, right? That is not reversible, that can't go back. Like once that happens, they can't go back and do it. So I'm just rolling. So so if you look at the action, right, the father's actions are always about relating to these poles, right? Even through the story, even after the mother dies, even and particularly after the mother dies, he continues to communicate through the poles, right? So even though the way he communicates changes, the fact that he's continuing to communicate through the poles doesn't change. Even when he's writing these notes and asking for forgiveness and writing love, it's still relating it through the poles, right? There's no information that the father has actually tried to do any of that connecting to the people. So to see that the mother dies, there is a change that happens to the father. So that's a good observation. And there is a change that, but the change that happens is part of the father's expression and emotional arc, is not necessarily in his activity. So so the part when the father dies, at that moment, the whole story just stops. So in terms of, that's it, the idea of the father and these poles stops with that. And on top of it, the poles become garbage, right? Become pointless, become unimportant. So so you could make an argument. So usually, so the climax is not that people are winning a prize or anything, but the climax is when the father dies. That's one of the, that's like the considered the official climax. I have found literary criticism that argues for the mother as well, that that is a legitimate case to see that, and that the father's death is part of the conclusion, right? So we'll look at this idea of the dramatic arc with A and P, but I love doing this as the first story, and I put this in the handout is so that we can have this discussion and be able to have, and the discussion very often breaks out this way, but it helps us breaks out with either the mother dying or the father dying or something like that, you know, and part of it is because you can make a strong argument for either one. If you were writing a paper on this and you made a legitimate argument, I would give you the credit, right? Because I feel like you use a story to support your point. So, so thank you. So that's why I was having you do the assignment so that you could look at it and talk about it. And then after we have this discussion, you might reconsider it, right? You might say, oh, okay, I could see that, or you might not. You might say, you know, I really strongly still feel that, and I can continue arguing back why this, you know, the change in the dramatic arc if I'm tracing, you know, the father's behavior as that. But yeah, but that was that. Sometimes an ending can add to the beginning. Yeah, I think it's interesting that also, I want you to look at this story, right? It's a tiny story. It is 2 paragraphs, right? But you could write about characters, you could write about plot, you could write about themes, right? You know, the idea of, I'm going to use just the last phrase that Alan gave, sometimes an ending can lead to a new beginning, right? There's several endings in this story, right? One ending that happens toward this main character, or the kind of an activity that has an impact, is when we left home, right? So that was what Adrian was bringing up. We left home. That's one like big shift that happens. Then the mother dies, right? So that's another ending. And then the father dies, right? That's another ending. Like not an ending to the story, but an end, right? How sometimes an end can lead to a new beginning. And then the sticks essentially die. They become garbage, right? So there's many ways you could look at this one little story and write an entire essay based on everything we just talked about, right? Based on the characters, based on the action, based on the dramatic arc, based on the endings of the story, based on the tone, how he almost unemotionally writes about these things. And we could say that like a death is, you know, it's very often causes change, an emotional change. It has an emotional impact, but we never get a sense of that emotional impact from this story. The writer, basically, the style of writing of just listing everything, almost like you're reading a newspaper article without any emotion in it, without any emotional words, right? There's no words that express feeling. There's no words that say sadness, excited. You know, there's one word that expresses it, and it's in relationship to the father and the poles. And that says that that's the only concession to glee, right? To excitement, to happiness were these poles, right? His primary relationship were with these poles, not with his family of possibly 6 kids and a wife. Anyway, so stories are you know, a little, even a small story like this can be very rich. Again, I do have a clock there. I have one on my computer, so I'm keeping track of the time. So any other questions or observations about what I've said about the climax of this story, or any reconsiderations on your part, or anything you want to share about Styx?
I have a question.
Yes.
Towards the end of the second paragraph, when he said forgive with a question mark, can you explain what that meant?
Like the fact that he has a question mark, or well, if you look at, I'm gonna answer it, and then you let me know if I answered it or I didn't. Okay.
Okay.
So if you notice the line before that, that's when he begins putting the string, right, and connecting the sticks, the 6 kids to the big stick, and then started typing things like apology, putting index cards that said apology, admitting to his errors, right, asking please for understanding, right, written frantic, so like almost like frantic is scribbling, nervous, frantic is right on index cards, and then he says a sign that said love. And then the other one is forgive with a question mark. So he's asking, the question mark creates asking. So he's asking for forgiveness, right? So so that's what that section was, that he was in this state of remorse, right? He was feeling remorse for how he behaved. He was realizing maybe his loneliness was giving him moments to realize, that he was a participant in creating his own loneliness, that if he had treated his family differently, that there would be a different relationship. I mean, they married, they had kids. That means there's grandkids. There's no indication that there is a sharing of this life, and this man is alone, right? And if he had 6 kids, there would be no reason why he would be alone. If he was a more caring and loving and giving father, he would have a different relationship with them. So to me, the forgive is that he's asking for forgiveness.
Okay, thank you. That cleared it up for me.
Okay. All right, cool. Any other questions or observations? Okay. So so let's do a little bit of a Tarzan swing to A&P, which is a story by John Updike. And so we'll do a couple things. I'm going to continue sharing my screen. I'm going to go to here. And let's see if I could move the chat out the way. And then I always... I'm sorry, I'm just... I'm just trying to make it bigger so you can all see it. Oh, here, no. Oh, wait, I forgot it's up here. Present is being blocked. Okay, so we got A&P by John Updike, and we'll pop in and out of this. So just give you a little intro on John Updike, who was born in 1932. So in 10 years-ish, he would have been 100 years old if he was still alive, but he passed in 2009. He was a novelist, a poet, a short story writer, art critic, a literary critic. He won Pulitzer Prize for fiction. He's won it more than once, and so he has that distinction of having won it more than once. And yes, I'm going to ask you what you mean by remember that. So he published more than 20 novels and short story collections, a dozen short story collections in poetry and art. And his Pulitzer Prize winning books are Rabbit is Rich, The Rabbit at Rest, and The Witches of Eastwick. And The Witch of Eastwick was made into a movie. I forget when, but a long time ago. And it has Susan Sarandon, Cher, Jack Nicholson, and one other woman. I'm trying to remember who was the third woman in it. But anyway, so he's an American writer, published lots of works, has done lots of things. So I'm gonna escape out of this, if it will let me. Yes, there we go. And I'm just going to read a little at the beginning of it, just to kind of bring John Updike's words into the room and to set up the story, and to kick off our discussion. Oh, okay, you read it as you read it before. Okay, good. I thank you for clarifying that. because I thought that when you said it last class, but I wasn't sure if you remember A&P as you remember A&P as being in the supermarket at some point, because there used to be A&Ps in the Bronx as well. And so as a kid growing up, I remember the A&P. So I'm going to read the first paragraph. So in walks these three girls in nothing but bathing suits. I'm in the third checkout slot with my back to the door, so I don't see them until they're over by the bread. The one that caught my eye first was the one in plaid green two-piece. She was a chunky kid with a good tan and a sweet, broad, soft-looking can with those two crescents of white just under it, where the sun never seems to hit. At the top of the back of her legs, I stood there with my hands on a box of Hi-Ho crackers trying to remember if I rang it up or not. I ring it up again and the customer starts giving me hell. She's one of those cash register watchers, a witch about 50 with rouge on her cheekbones and no eyebrows, and I know it made her day to trip me up. She'd been watching cashier registers 40 years and probably never seen a mistake before. Okay, so at the beginning of the story, we meet a narrator. We make an assumption that the narrator is a young man. You can make that assumption, but he's watching three girls. So what happens is three girls walk into a supermarket and he's watching them, and he's watching them to the point that he is distracted by them, because the minute and the distraction is shown by he is supposed to ring up a can of a box of Hi-Ho crackers. And Hi-Ho crackers, I don't know if they still exist, but Hi-Ho are like Ritz crackers, right? And trying to remember if I rang it up or not. But he rings it up, and then the woman, gets upset at him, rightfully so. Nobody likes to be anything rung up more than once. And but he kind of gives us an idea of like who she is. So just from the first paragraph, we're getting a sense of, remember, at the beginning of a story is exposition, right? And exposition means at the beginning, they're setting up the story. So some of the things they try to ground you in the first paragraph or at the very beginning should be a sense of character, should be a sense of place, setting, and should be a sense of plot. Like at the beginning, it should start be setting that up for you. So in the beginning, we meet a narrator. At this point, we meet three girls, right? We just, and he's describing one of them, right? And I'm going to speak about the way he's describing and what he's looking at. And then the third thing, he makes a mistake because he's so distracted, and a woman that's online catches him, right? So that's like the beginning, the exposition, right? Hi-Ho's not made anymore, right? Thanks for that. So the other thing, so let's talk about that, Alan's comment about Hi-Ho not being made anymore. So sometimes the story may not tell you exactly the date that it is set in, right? But you can infer information, right, from it. So the fact that he's mentioning Hi-Ho crackers, which is something that isn't made anymore, lets you know that it's not a modern day story, that it's a story set sometime in the past, right? Also the fact that the young girls are wearing, at least one of them is wearing a two-piece suit, also gives us a marker of time, because there was a time in our history where women did not wear two-piece bathing suits, right? They wore there's a time they wore much longer. Even men used to have this shirt with shorts that went down to your knee, kind of outfit, like a unitard at some point, that covered most of the body. And but as time progressed, particularly from the 50s into the 60s, that's when the two-piece began showing up. So the fact that he makes a point of the two-piece gives us a sense of setting. So even though it doesn't say, in walks these three girls wearing bathing suits into the A&P supermarket on such and such date, blah, 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 in this town, in this place. There's another thing we can infer about setting in the beginning paragraph based on what the young women are wearing is what? What do you think we can infer? You can chat it or speak it. What can we imply?
That it's unusual for the times.
Yes, yes, that it's unusual.
And for at the location.
Say it again.
And at the location, I mean, it's very unusual to everybody because everybody's watching them. I mean,
right. So then we'll talk about that, because that's part of the setting too. The reaction to it is part of the setting, right? And we're gonna have that in a moment. But let's just stick with this first paragraph, right? So in the first paragraph, I can't believe it's already 117, 116. The first paragraph, we the fact that they're wearing bathing suits tells you also what time of year it is, unless it's winter and they're walking around in bathing suits in winter. That would be weird. And then on top of that, even in the summer, right? I go to the supermarket here in the middle of the summer in Harlem, down the block, and I don't see people walking around in bathing suits, right? So it would, but there is a place near a beach place that I go to, and people are always shopping in their bathing suits. So it gives you a sense of year, like time of year. So most likely it's summer. And two, it also gives you a sense of location, that wherever this place is, there's got to be a beach nearby. The three young people are going to walk into the supermarket to pick something up wearing a bathing suit, right? So you learn a lot in this first paragraph, this paragraph of exposition. So what do you mean, Coral? The narrator gives us, oh, okay, many details to involve this arc. Yes, yeah, right? Which is interesting, right? Different. So now, little tiny story with sticks, 2 paragraphs, a lot of information packed in there, right? But here, even though this story is not considered a long story by any chance, John Updike is building a story, right? And he's using these details to involve the reader. And a lot of it can come at you like really fast, but it gives you, but that's why that's why you're in an English class, and that's why we're doing this. We're slowing down together to look at this story. Let's see, I'm just seeing the chat. I'm trying to think how to keep the chat open, but here, I just put it over here to the side. Right, theme of rebellion. Yes, we're gonna get to the theme of rebellion at the beginning, because that is what I think Christian was talking about. So one last thing we learn about Sammy is that Sammy, right, we learn his name later. We know that Sammy likes girls because he's checking this one out, and he's checking out her can, and her can is another word for butt, right? So he's checking out her backs of her legs, he's checking out the can, and in this idea of checking her out is when he loses track of the crackers, of whether he rung them up or not, right? So he gets distracted. So we start learning something about Sammy, right? So we learned that Sammy works at a supermarket. We know that Sammy is into girls because he's checking her out, and to the point that he gets distracted, right? The next paragraph, he goes, by the time I got her feathers smooth and her goodies in a bag, she gives me a little snort. In passing, if she'd been born at the right time, they would have burned her over in Salem. By the time, okay, so let me just slow down and read that again. By the time I got her feathers smooth, he's referring to the woman that was yelling at him, and her goodies into a bag, she gives me a little snort in passing. If she'd been born at the right time, they would have burned her over in Salem. Okay. By the time I get her on her way, the girls had circled around the bread and were coming back without a push cart. So he said that phrase, they would have burned her over in Salem. He refers to her as a witch. And those of you who may have heard about the Salem witch trials, they burned women who they thought were witches. So he was continuing that idea, the description of his customer as being a witch, right? But then the action continues. These young girls are walking around the supermarket. So I'm going to switch over to the PowerPoint minute and here and speak a little bit more about the setting of the story, right? To go to the beginning? No, good. We'll start there, AP setting. So essentially, if we look at the story, one way we could always talk about a story, we say, okay, class, in the room, we'll be like, all right, tell me the setting. What's the setting of the story? And then you all would popcorn tell me elements about the setting. So the setting is set in a supermarket, right? The chain supermarket is now a fixture of American life, and the A&P grocery chain was one of the pioneers in this industry, right? Paving the way for supermarkets and superstores that we see today. So back in the 50s and 60s, A&P was like a new thing, right? Like before, even in New York City, the way people shopped, believe it or not, people would like Key Foods. Now we have Key Foods, we have Fine Fare, we have all these other supermarkets, but A&P was like that. But the way people used to shop in the past is that I remember even being a little kid before there was a big supermarket in my neighborhood in the Bronx. My grandmother would go to the bodega and she would get food there. There was a meat market, and she would go to the meat market and she would buy the meat at the meat market and fish if we were having fish. There was like another place that she bought vegetables at. So it was like that. Milk was delivered to our house, right? You can have eggs delivered to our house too, and they had that. So they got so. But then like the supermarket came, and you just went one place, and you got everything. You got milk, you got food, you got cheese, you got meat, you got you got everything. So it was a shift that was happening. Also, the going to the theme of rebellion. There was something, and we talked about that. Like someone, I think it was Christian or someone was saying how there was something. Not only that it was unusual for them to be walking around the supermarket like this, but it was causing different reactions. Right? Some people were not down with that. Right? They were like, that is inappropriate for them to be walking around like hardly clothed. Right? And and of course, Sammy had no issue with it because because of he was enjoying what he was seeing. But in Sammy's eyes, as we read the story, we see that the AMP reflects the idea of conformist tendencies of his community, right? He sees his store patrons, he calls them sheep or followers rather than independent thinkers, right? In an interview about the story, Updike said, in those days in America, the 1950s and 60s, people were by and large conformed and were expected to conform. Conform means you to follow the rules of society, right? In the 1950s and 60s, right? Particularly the 50s going into the 60s. People were expected to like do the right thing, to obey the rules of society, right? But it was also a time as we go into the 60s, right? And we'll learn some of these names later on as we continue to explore poetry in this slam poetry section at the end of class. But he says that he's referring to voices of dissent. Dissent means disagreement, right? Disagreement with the idea of I have to conform, I have to be the way society tells me to be, right? So there were, in the 1950s and 60s, there was poets like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, and there was a TV actor named James Dean, a movie actor named James Dean, who were willing to risk embarrassment, right? Quit their jobs or otherwise take a stand for individual freedom, right? So there were these people they would call them counterculture because the culture was like conform, right? Dress a certain kind of way, behave a certain kind of way, do things this way, get married, don't wait too late, get married young, have children, build a family. And that's what everybody should do. Men go to work, women should be prepared to take care of the house, and that's her job. And that was very powerful in the 1950s. It was like, and so not that kind of way of life is bad or is wrong, but that's not the only way human beings can live. We can live all different kinds of ways. So in the 50s and 60s, there was this voices of dissent. There was these, and it was usually led by young people. And one thing I love about like history, when we think of all the things that cause change and happen, it's young people that lead it, right? People in their teens and 20s, right, have incredible impacts. Of course, they continue in their 30s and 40s and become presidents and all that kind of stuff and change. But a lot of the initial change, the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes, Zora Hurston, all those people were in their freaking 20s. They were like 20 years old, 19. So same thing with Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. These were young people. If you do the math, John Updike was older in the 60s, right? In the 50s and 60s. He was born in the 30s, right? But he was still, in the 50s, he was in his 20s, right? So he was a young person experiencing these things, and he began writing when he was in his teens. So, okay, we have voices of dissent today. Yes, right. They continue, right? Because there's always a sense of conforming that that society tries to make, and sometimes those things shift because even as we learn more as time goes on, those ideas of what is acceptable changes, right? So I want to talk more about that because I love talking about all that stuff. But let's just go quickly into the characters, right? So we have Sammy, right? And we what do we learn of Sammy, right? What do we know about Sammy? I'm gonna just do this. I'm gonna put the characters, right? These are the main characters. In the classroom, very often I, put down the characters and we popcorn style say like who they are. But I'm doing this, I'm pausing for a minute because this is another way you could look at the stories, right? If you're writing an essay, you can say, I'm gonna do a character analysis of the characters in the story, of the main characters in the story. And you can do an analysis of each of these characters. In this story, we happen to have at least 6 clear characters, and all the characters, as they should in any short story, have a function or a role, right? So with Sammy, he is the narrator, right? And we learn that he's young. I believe Sammy is 19, and he works in the supermarket. Clearly, we learn something about him by the end of the story, which is a very interesting end to the story. Then we have Queenie, who's part of the 3 young women that walk into the supermarket. And Queenie seems to be the leader of them because she's the one that is a spokesperson for them. And then we have the girl in the plaid bikini and the tall girl, which are the ones he also describes. Then we have Stokesy, who is the guy that kind of works next to him, is his buddy that works next to him. And then you get a sense of them working next to each other for a bit. And then we have Lengel, and Lengel is the manager of it. So if we look at setting, which we talked about first, character, which we're talking about second, and then plot, right, which is in this case, I put down the dramatic arc of it. I left the climax, oops, let's see, how do you go back? Right, so we have, oh, I forgot, once I'm in presentation, I can't edit. So we have exposition, right? So at the beginning of the story, we spent a lot of time talking about more exposition, but essentially we follow the plot, the action. The 3 girls walk in bathing suits in a grocery store, right? And Sammy, the cashier, observes them, right? So that's the setting, right? The exposition, the beginning of the story. But then the rising action continues with these 3 girls, right? Because of the way they are dressed, right? So that's like, because they're dressed that way, remember plot is because of this, then that happens. Because they happen to be dressed that way, it causes reactions, right? Sammy's like, I'm down with that look, right? The manager arrives, but the manager and some other folks in the supermarket are not so down. And the manager, who is in a position of power, right? In the supermarket, he has power. He's the manager. What he says goes, right? So the manager arrives and tells the girls that they are dressed inappropriately, while the girls are in Sammy's checkout lane, preparing to pay and be on their way. But Lengel feels the need to tell them that they aren't dressed right for the A&P, right? So then suddenly that's the rising action. There's a confrontation, right, that happens there. And then the next on the dramatic arc would be the climax. So again, many of you, I think there was more consensus with this. So in this story, what was the climax? You can voice it or put it in
When
the
he
chat.
quit his job.
Okay, Christian, we got one when he quits his job. There seemed to be consensus on that, right? And when I'm judging from your responses, for those of you who responded. So why when he quits his job?
I guess because that's a turning action of the story. Like his life's gonna change at that point. Things are gonna change because he doesn't have a job anymore, and there's like a confrontation between him and the manager. So it changes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there is a change to the protagonist, who's the main character in the story. Once he makes that decision, there's no going back. He could have, right? There's that moment where he decides maybe, there's a moment where Lengel, and we're going to read the ending, and we're going to read one other section before class is over. There's a moment when he could have taken it back, but he doesn't, right? He doesn't. He goes through with it, right? And then there's the falling action, right? So once Sammy makes his decision, I can't write it in there. I'll write it later when I get out of this presentation mode. So falling action, is Sammy serious, or will Lengel threats make him change his mind? But there's a moment when we wonder whether Lengel will call Sammy's bluff and Sammy will stay at the A&P, but Sammy takes off his apron, right, and bow tie, and leaving his A&P gear on the counter, right? Symbolic. The shedding, right, takes off the apron, the bow tie, right? The symbols of that. And the boss is like, make sure you're gonna do this, I'm gonna let your parents know, that whole thing. And we learned earlier that he lives with his parents because we know that, what does his mother do? She irons his shirts, the shirts that he has to wear to go to work, right? And then the denouement, or the conclusion, Sammy watches Lango from outside the A&P. He's alone in the parking lot watching his ex-boss through the window, doing his old job. Sammy feels a sense of dread because he knows quitting his job will make things harder for him in the future. But the last line suggests, and I didn't finish my thought there, but the last line, or the last section suggests that there's a line that says that once you make a decision, you go through with it, right? And so this is considered sometimes a coming of age story. And a coming of age story usually is a story about a passage from either adulthood, young adulthood, into adulthood, right? Sometimes there are rituals, but in this idea of making a decision, having a conviction, taking a stand is considered for us like something that an adult decision. I have to make a decision, I have to make a choice, and then I'm gonna support that choice that I make, right? Let me get out of this for a moment and look at the story a little more at A&P. I wanna talk about, because there's so many themes and ideas, and we probably won't get to all of them, but maybe I'm going to pick up on the one that here it says, what he meant was our town is 5 miles from the beach. So there's information that you start learning as you read it. Let's see. But yeah, so here, and I apologize. Normally I have a handout, but I think I told you I moved, and so I'm sitting here all like dressed and ready. But if I twist my camera here, you'll see a ton of boxes. So I'm still living in a ton of boxes. So my handout, where I already have things highlighted that I want to read, so is there. So here it is. So it says, I'm here, this is toward the end. It says, Queenie blushes, though it may be just a brush of sunburn I was noticing for the first time, right? This is after Lango has said, girls, this isn't the beach, right? And scolding them. Queenie blushes, though maybe it's just when I noticed for the first time, now that she was so close, she says, my mother asked me to pick up a jar of herring snacks. Her voice kind of startled me, the way voices do when you see people first, coming out so flat and dumb, yet kind of tony too. The way it ticked over pick up and snacks. All of a sudden, I slid down her voice into her living room. Her father and other men were standing around in ice cream coats and bow ties, and the women were in sandals picking herring snacks on toothpicks off of a big plate, and they were all holding drinks the color of water with olives and sprigs of mint in them. When my parents have somebody over, they get lemonade, and if it's real racy affair, Schlitz in tall glasses with they'll do it every time. They'll do it every time cartoons stenciled on them, right? So I'm stopping with that paragraph and reading that paragraph a little bit because that moment, right? So Queenie speaks. My mother asked me to pick up a jar of herring snacks. And the way she speaks, right? He says the way it ticked over pick up and snacks, there was like a little tick in those things. He goes, all of a sudden, I slid right down her voice into her living room. Now we know he didn't literally do that, but it's saying the way she spoke gave him some information about who she was, or made him think about who she might be, right? And the who she might be is that her father and other men are standing around in ice cream coats and bow ties. So ice cream coats, people who used to sell ice cream before back in the day wore white jackets, jackets that like suit jacket looking things, and bow ties, right? So already there's a jacket and a bow tie, right? That these men are hanging around, right? And the women, right, are in sandals and they're picking up the herring snacks on toothpicks off of a big plate. So there's some big plate either on a table or being passed around, and they're doing that. And they were all holding drinks the color of water with olives and a sprig of mint in them. So they were either having martinis or something like that they were having, right? So there's an element of fanciness, right? An element of education that he is picking up in her voice and imagining the life that she has, right? And then he says, contrast it to his life. When my parents have somebody over, they get lemonade, right? But if it's a real racy affair, that means they're serving liquor. It's Schlitz. And Schlitz is like, it's a beer. It's very much like Budweiser, right? Not the most fancy beer or expensive. In tall glasses with, they'll do it every time, cartoons stenciled on it, like some group of cartoon, like glasses that have a saying on them. And one of the things back in the day used to kind of, back in the day, they used to buy jelly, Welch's grape jelly in jars, but the jars, when you were done, would become a glass, like that you could use, to drink, anything out of. So there's also the implication that they either got them very cheaply or they got it for free, right? So he's making a class distinction between himself and the three girls that come into the supermarket. And so what does he do for that? He decides he wants to take a stand, right? And I'm going to the top. This is the last section. I'm going to read a little bit of here, and then we may be almost done with class. So he says that they're not dressed decently, and Queenie says we are decent. Those are her words that John Updike gives her. Queenie says suddenly her lower lip pushing, getting sore now that she remembers her place, a place from which the crowd that runs the A&P must look pretty crummy. Fancy herring snacks flash in her very blue eyes. Girls, I don't want to argue with you. After this, come in here with your shoulders covered. It's our policy. He turns his back. That's policy for you. Policy is what kingpins want. What the others want is juvenile delinquency. All this while the customers had been showing up with their carts. But sheep seeing a scene. They had all bunched up on Stokesy, who shook open a paper bag as gently as peeling a peach, not wanting to miss a word. I could feel the silence, everybody getting nervous, most of all Lengel, who asked me, Sammy, have you rung up this purchase? I thought and said, no, but it wasn't about that I was thinking. I go through the punches, 4, 9, guac talk. It's more like complicated than you think. That's him bringing up the cash register. It begins to make a little song that you hear words to, in my case, hello, bing, there you go, gong, happy. So he's talking about using like imagery to talk about him ringing up the cash register. I'm hopping to the next paragraph. The girls who blame them are in a hurry to get out. So I say, I quit to Lengel, quick enough for them to hear, hoping they'll stop and watch me, their unsuspected hero. They keep right on going into the electric eye. The door flies open and they flicker across the lot to their car. Queenie and Plaid and big tall Goonie Goonie, not that as raw material she was so bad, leaving me with Lengel and a kink in his eyebrows. So Angel's like, what? And he says, did you say something? So the women who are in a different class, they almost don't care about what he's saying. And they take off, right? They're like, well, I got scolded. I stood up for myself. I'm out of here. And they leave. But then Sammy says it so that they can hear it. But so if they can hear it, everybody hears it, right? And then Lengel's like, did you say something? And then he says it, repeats it. I said, I quit. He said, I thought you did. He goes, you didn't have to embarrass them. It was they who were embarrassing us, right? So again, the idea of that time, Sammy's like, he embarrassed them by bringing this to them and scolding them in front of everybody. And the guy's like, no, they're embarrassing us. They were dressed inappropriately. It's against my policy, right? Then Sammy says, I started to say something that came out fiddly-do. It's saying my grandmother's, and I know she would have been pleased. I don't think you know what you're saying, Lengel says. He says, I know you don't, I said, but I do. I pull the bow at the end of my apron and start shrugging it off my shoulders. A couple of customers that had been heading for my slot begin to knock against each other like scared pigs in a chute, another reference to them being like animals and followers. Lengel sighs, begins to look very patient and old and gray. He's been a friend of my parents for years. Sammy, you don't want to do this to your mom and dad, he tells me. It's true. I don't. But it seems to me that once you begin a gesture, it's fatal not to go through with it. I fold the apron Sammy stitch on the red in the pocket and put it in the counter and drop the bow tie on top of it. The bow tie is theirs, if you've ever wondered. You'll feel this for the rest of your life, L'Engle says, and I know that's true. But remembering how he made that pretty girl blush makes me so scrunchy inside. I punch the no sale tab and the machine whirs, people, and the drawer splats out. One advantage to this scene taking place in summer is I can follow this up with a clean exit. There's no fumbling around getting your coat and galoshes. I just saunter into the electric eye in my white shirt that my mother ironed the night before, and the door heaves itself open, and outside, the sunshine is skating on the asphalt. I look around for my girls, but they're gone, of course. There wasn't anybody but some young married screaming with her children about some candy they didn't get by the door of a powder blue Falcon station wagon. Looking back in the big windows, over the bags of peat moss and aluminum lawn furniture stacked on the pavement, I could see L'Engle in my place in the slot, checking the sheep through. His face was dark, gray, and his back stiff, as if he just had an injection of iron, and my stomach kind of fell as I felt how hard the world was going to be to me hereafter. So we could, let's see, L'Engle is the obstacle, yes. Can be like an anecdote. I want to know what you mean by that. Coral, and I remember when I moved 13 years ago. Yeah, Coral, what can it be like an anecdote? What do you mean by that? You can type it. Story about childhood. Yeah, yes. Yes, definitely a story about childhood, definitely a story about coming of age. I mean, I'm gonna jump to the chase a little bit and because we're at the end of class, but there's so many themes in there. There was like a rebellion, right? That I think Alan offered earlier in the class. There's the idea of appearances, like how a person is supposed to look, how a person is supposed to behave, and then therefore the rebelling against that. There's a theme of power, right? Of the boss's power, right? But also of Sammy's power. Like, what power does Sammy have? If you want to stick up for somebody, if you want to take a stand and stand up for somebody, right? There's the things of power, the things of principles, right? L'Engle had principles, but Sammy had principles, like don't treat people that way. His motivation may have been like maybe a little misguided. And then there's also the dynamic of gender, right? In many ways, right, that we can unpack gender. I'm going to hold gender for a minute, but society and class, right? The idea of society and class, how that impacts interactions. And so that's in there. But gender, right? And in terms of gender, one thing that's really interesting is Sammy being this young person that's kind of really preoccupied with these young women and their bodies, right? And these young women written this way, in the way in which they're written. So we can, if we want to, we can talk more about this on Monday. But what I will do is, you have one story that you need to read. I believe it's just one. It's a short story as well. Or maybe it might be two, because I think maybe I was trying to read a third one today. But the stories are included in the course content section, and they are One of These Days is one of the stories that you need to read. And then check your email, and I will give you more info on what the next step is. So next class, we can pick up, if you want to talk more about A&P, we will. That PowerPoint that I was just working on, I'm going to upload it onto Blackboard. So we'll have it as a reflective of this class. I'll add some more things in terms of the themes inside of it. But we'll continue talking about this. You'll read your new things. If you haven't done your essay, get it in. Most of you did, so that's great. I'm going to begin grading in the next day or two. And then, but the idea is that by Monday, I'll have them all graded so that we can have a discussion on the essays. You could take a look at them, and then we'll definitely follow up on A&P, and then do One of These Days at the very least. Okay.
Professor, when will we get feedback on the climax assignment?
I want to grade your papers first, but
oh, okay.
So if I get to grade them before Monday, I'll do that, but if not, then after Monday, I'll give you feedback on the climax stuff.
Sounds good. No problem.
All right,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Any other questions folks may have? If not, you know what to do. You're done. Just say good night. Have a good day.
Professor, did you get my paper?
Do you want to hold on a second? I can check really quickly.
Sure.
All right.
Bye, Professor.
All right. Take care. Enjoy your weekends.
Have a good day, Professor.
All right. Thank you.
I sent it to you by direct message by accident, but have a good day. It's Christian, Professor, so my attendance is recorded.
Okay. Yeah. And I see your essay. So Dana, you were the one who were asking?
No, Kayla.
I'm sorry, Kayla.
It's okay.
Let's see. So Kayla, I don't see it. Did
Okay.
you upload to Blackboard?
Yeah, and I had restarted my computer at the time, like during that night, and I don't know if it went through. That's why I had to
Yeah.
ask.
Yeah, it's not I don't see it. So if you could send it, that'd be great.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thanks. I
All
look
right.
forward to reading it and have a good
Thank
weekend.
you too.
Okay. Okay, everybody's gone except for Chantel.